August 14th, 2005. 121 people board Helios Airways Flight 522, expecting a routine trip from Cyprus to Prague. Minutes after takeoff, a tiny switch, overlooked during a midnight maintenance check, sets off a chain of silent, lethal failures. How did an entire flight crew, armed with training and technology, lose control to something so simple? This is how a modern jet, and everyone on board, vanished into disaster, leaving a question that haunts aviation. How did this happen? At 9:07 on the morning of August 14, 2005, Helios Airways Flight 522 lifted off from Larnaca International Airport in Cyprus. The Boeing 737-300 carried 115 passengers and 6 crew, most of them Cypriot and Greek families, including 22 children. The flight's destination was Prague, with a scheduled stop in Athens. The route traced a familiar arc over the Aegean, a path the airline had flown countless times before. Captain Hans-Jürgen Merten, age 59, sat in the left seat. He brought more than 16,900 hours of flight experience, over 5,500 of them on Boeing 737s. First Officer Pampos Charalambos, 51, had logged 7,549 hours, with nearly 4,000 on this same aircraft type. Both were considered seasoned, steady hands in the cockpit. The rest of the crew included 4 flight attendants, among them Andreas Prodromou, a 25-year-old with a UK commercial pilot's license and basic 737 training. The passenger list reflected a cross-section of everyday life: families returning from summer holidays, couples heading home, business travelers, and children on vacation. As the jet taxied and took off under clear skies, there was little to suggest anything out of the ordinary. The flight plan called for a climb to cruising altitude, a brief stop in Athens, and then onward to Prague. In the cabin, seatbelts clicked, overhead bins latched, and the routine hum of travel settled in. The aircraft climbed steadily, autopilot holding its programmed course. No one on board could have known that a single overlooked detail from the night before, a setting buried in the technical panels, would soon place every life on board in jeopardy. On the night of August 13th, a maintenance engineer worked through routine checks on the Boeing 737-300's pressurization system. The procedure called for a leak test, which required switching the pressurization mode from auto to manual. In manual, the outflow valve could be controlled directly, making it possible to build up and monitor pressure inside the sealed cabin. According to the maintenance log, this step was completed, but there is no record of the selector being returned to auto. Boeing's manuals specify that after such tests, the mode must be reset before the aircraft is cleared for flight. In this case, the sign-off appears to have relied on memory or habit, with no formal cross-check or second signature to confirm the correct setting. With the selector left in manual, the system's automatic controls were bypassed. On the ground, the difference is subtle. Annunciator lights on the overhead panel indicate the mode, but there are no other cues. Once airborne, however, the consequences are profound. In auto, the digital cabin pressure controller gradually closes the outflow valve as the aircraft climbs, maintaining safe cabin pressure. In manual, unless the crew intervenes, the valve remains in its last position, allowing cabin altitude to rise unchecked as the aircraft ascends. Flight data recorder evidence later confirmed that the outflow valve stayed nearly fixed during the climb. The system never shifted to automatic regulation. This single missed step, one switch, buried among dozens, set the stage for a silent, invisible threat. There was no mechanical failure, no warning light before takeoff. The risk was planted on the ground, hidden in a routine that should have ended with a simple turn of a knob. At 12,040 feet, a sharp electronic horn sounded in the cockpit of Helios 522. On this Boeing 737-300, the same piercing tone warned of 2 very different dangers: a takeoff configuration problem on the ground, or dangerously low cabin pressure in the air. The design offered no distinction. In the cockpit, Captain Merton and First Officer Charalambous focused on the familiar. Cockpit voice recorder analysis later captured their repeated references to equipment cooling and air conditioning. Lines like, "Are you sure the cooling fans are working?" and "Check the air conditioning panel." Each checklist they pulled reinforced the wrong diagnosis. The actual threat, rising cabin altitude, remained unaddressed. As the aircraft climbed, the cabin altitude rose with it. By the time the warning horn sounded, the cabin had already passed 10,000 feet, where oxygen levels begin to drop. Above 14,000 feet, time of useful consciousness can shrink to minutes. Hypoxia set in quietly, eroding judgment and memory. Speech grew slower, responses less coordinated. The cockpit transcript shows confusion deepening, calls to maintenance, checklist recitations, then fragmented exchanges. In the cabin, oxygen masks dropped automatically, but on the flight deck, neither pilot donned a mask. The effects of hypoxia, impaired reasoning, tunnel vision, loss of motor control, progressed unchecked. Radio calls faded, and eventually, silence took hold. The autopilot maintained course, but the crew was no longer capable of action. With no one left able to respond, the aircraft continued its programmed flight path, setting the stage for intervention from outside the cockpit. Greek air defense scrambled two F-16s as the unresponsive Boeing circled above Athens. At 11:32, the fighter pilots drew alongside Helios 522. Through the cockpit windows, they saw the first officer slumped over the controls, unmoving. Oxygen masks hung from their overhead panels. The cabin, eerily still, showed no signs of life except for the faint movement of a single figure. Minutes passed as the aircraft traced slow, looping orbits. The F-16s maintained close formation, searching for any signal or response. Then, at 11:49, a new figure appeared in the cockpit. A flight attendant, later identified as Andreas Prodromou, an DRE as Pro-DRO Mu. Wearing an oxygen mask, he took the captain's seat and grasped the controls. Prodromou, just 25 years old, held a commercial pilot's license and had trained on the 737. He tried to steady the aircraft and attempted to transmit a distress call, but there was no reply from the ground. The left engine flamed out moments later, starved of fuel. The right engine failed 10 minutes after that. With both engines silent, the jet began a slow, uncontrolled descent. At 12:03, Helios 522 struck a hillside near the village of Grammatiko, northwest of Athens. The wreckage scattered across the dry, rugged terrain. All 121 people on board were lost. The crash site, remote and difficult to reach, became the focus of a massive emergency response. The disaster would soon dominate headlines, raising urgent questions about how a modern airliner could become unreachable, and why the last hope for survival had come from a young flight attendant's final, solitary effort. According to the official report by the Air Accident Investigation and Aviation Safety Board, the direct cause of the Helios Airways Flight 522 tragedy was the failure to recognize that the pressurization mode selector remained in manual throughout pre-flight, takeoff, climb, and cruise. This oversight meant the aircraft was not pressurizing automatically. As a result, the crew did not respond to the cabin altitude warning horn or the deployment of passenger oxygen masks. The sequence ended with crew incapacitation from hypoxia and total loss of control. Contributing factors named by the board include the misidentification of the warning horn, incomplete checklist use, and breakdowns in crew resource management under hypoxic conditions. The investigation also cited inadequate training and oversight at the airline, regulatory supervision lapses, and the ambiguous design of the warning systems, specifically the shared horn for both cabin altitude and takeoff configuration alerts. Aviation regulators and industry leaders responded to the Helios disaster with sweeping changes. Airlines worldwide rewrote standard operating procedures to require the immediate use of oxygen masks at any sign of cabin altitude warning, and introduced mandatory hypoxia recognition training for crews. Maintenance departments adopted strict cross-verification protocols, with documented sign-offs to confirm the pressurization selector is set to auto after every test. Boeing and other manufacturers issued service bulletins to redesign oral warning systems, mandating distinct sounds for cabin altitude and takeoff configuration alerts. These directives, reinforced by legal actions and regulatory audits, aimed to close the gaps exposed by Helios 522, ensuring that a single missed switch, a confusing horn, or a skipped checklist could never again lead to such a tragedy. On August 14, 2005, 121 people lost their lives when Helios Airways Flight 522 crashed near Grammatico, Greece. The official investigation by the AAIASB found that a single pressurization switch left in manual mode, combined with cockpit alarm confusion and impaired crew decision-making, led directly to the tragedy. Despite extensive analysis, the exact reasons why neither pilot correctly identified the cabin altitude warning remain unclear, and some maintenance documentation from the night before has not been fully released. In response, airlines worldwide updated checklist procedures, redesigned warning systems, and mandated faster use of oxygen masks. These measures are documented in regulatory advisories and training manuals now in use. The legacy of Helios 522 is a lasting reminder. Even a small oversight, if unchecked by process and design, can have catastrophic consequences. Aviation safety today still builds on the hard lessons learned from this disaster.